I think one clear thread and is the focus on the child. It's a very often used word, child-centric.
That this much stuff in the book is to be taken and put into the children's heads, And that whole inputting metaphor is so strong that most educationists, I certainly wouldn't say all, the nature of life in a sense, I think is Namaste, Namaskara, and welcome to the Prakriya podcast, Change the Rules of Learning. So, joining me in this episode is Indira Vijay Simha, and we will be trying to focus on the kind of learning that happens in alternative schools and what makes them different from other kinds of schools. So, first of all, let me introduce you to Indira. She is a very old friend, and I met her first when I put in my children into her school, and her school was one of the earliest alternative schools I came across in Bangalore. I think after the KFI schools, I've only heard of Purna Learning Center, which Indira started, she said, in 1993. Indira is a person who has spent all her working life exploring education. She first worked with Center for Environmental Education and then started, and she worked for a mainstream school for a while and then started Purna Learning Center. And I think after a couple of decades or 2-3 decades of working with Purna, she joined Azim Premji University. So that is Indira for you. We shall discover more of her thoughts on alternative education. Indira, we'll straight away go into certain questions that we will try to thresh out, mostly you, little bit me. The thing is, the issue of alternative schools is something that does concern some people, especially in urban areas. And there are a lot of people wondering what is the difference between alternative schools and mainstream schools. At one level, those of us who have been involved in alternative education don't much like these terms, these differences made, or they are not really watertight compartments. But at the same time, they are quite convenient to use because alternative schools do generally believe in engaging with multiple ways of learning. And while they also are engaged with exams and so on, but there's a lot more that they try to work on with the facilitators themselves and with the children and so on. So I would like to ask you, Indira, what made you take this step of starting Purna Learning Center?
Yeah, I mean, things have changed in Bangalore in particular, but 30 years ago, alternative schools, as you were mentioned, were few and far between. And it really began with my own discomfort with mainstream education and the strong emphasis on only very narrow bookish learning at the cost of the holistic development of the child. And that learning actually seemed to disconnect the child from the world, both the natural world and the social world, and kind of have some kind of focus on achievement and exams. And as a teacher, I wasn't comfortable, forcing children into that path. I thought children have their own innate, way of developing, of connecting, of really, their journey should be one of joy mostly, not one of struggle and being, they get labeled in many ways. So I felt that wasn't the way education should be. And I think growing up, thanks to my parents and the place where I grew up, I was introduced to both the ideas of Tagore and Montessori, Gandhi to some extent. And I think somewhere all these ideas seem to, be speaking and saying, why not we take that step? And for my own children, I thought I should try. That's how.
Yeah. I think I've heard you say that you started with your own children.
Right.
And your kitchen was also your laboratory.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, what happened from those early days? How did it grow?
That was then, and I wasn't thinking at all in terms of commercial, ideas. Even now, I feel education should be thought of as a gift that we give to our own future, right? So it's not something that you look at in terms of investment. Maybe 30 years ago, I was even more naive. But at the same time, I said, if nothing else, I am capable of educating my own children. And we have enough things in the kitchen to learn about pressure, heat, chemical reactions, biology. It's all around us. And that's how it started. Pretty soon, 6 months down the line, there was another family, very interesting person, Darshan Shankar, who is himself founder of this institution called, Foundation for Revitalization of Local Health Tradition. Now they have a transdisciplinary university, very out-of-the-box thinker. And he came and he had also 3 children. And we had a long conversation, I remember. And from the next day, there were 3 more children at home. That's how it really started. But to Darshan's credit, or I must say, he was the one who said, you have to try and institutionalize, because our country needs different kinds of institutions. And so he kind of encouraged that, we register as a trust and so on and so forth.
Yeah. So I forgot to say that Indira is basically a person who's been into science a great deal.
Yeah.
And when you mentioned that the kitchen is a good place to learn physics and chemistry and biology, I remembered that. And Darshan Shankar is another great thinker, who's done some phenomenal work in starting that Ayurvedic and more integrated medicine university. So I think it was started by very enlightened people. You started a school, with a certain purpose, with a certain mission almost, because you seem to have no idea of putting your children back into mainstream schools. And it sort of evolved into, I would say, an alternative school. Maybe you didn't think of the word at the beginning when you started it. But yet, later on, you would have observed many things about yourself, about your school and other schools. So what do you think is a big difference between alternative and mainstream schools? Because we are trying to elaborate on what is the difference between these kinds of schools.
Yeah. I think one clear thread is the focus on the child. It's a very often used word, child-centric. But I think alternative schools are deliberately child-centric. And I think that is where it connects with what I was talking about, the Tagore story about educating a parrot. And Tagore seemed to be saying that in the process of teaching the parrot certain manners and things like Sanskrit and Vedas and so on, you forget the parrot itself and its happiness, and even simple things like what it means to be is forgotten. So I think alternative schools, and it's a very long tradition. You can talk of Rousseau or Montessori and so on. There are many people who have thought about, how we cannot ignore the child at the center. And I think that is one of the ideas. And the child is meant to grow up in nature. So children, and the whole process of removing the children from a natural environment. If you observe children, you will see that they play with their surroundings, whether it's mud or water, or in a city, they will also be observing the vehicles and so on and so forth. So this is, I think, one of the ideas which is probably common to most alternative schools, that you keep the child and the child's needs and at the center of the educational process, rather than make the child fit into some idea of education. You make the process of education match the needs, or responsive to the needs of the child.
Yeah, I would agree that, in education, it's not a matter of the teachers inputting stuff into a child, as if the child is just some piece of furniture or something very static.
Yeah.
Whereas, I'm reminded of Vivekananda's statement that you cannot teach a child any more than you can grow a plant.
Right.
You can only help it to go forward in its own way.
Yeah.
So I'm with you in that it has to be, learning has to be child-centric. But another thing that we have been working with is to make the whole learning process holistic. It also has to be facilitator or teacher-centric in some ways, because a teacher who is not aware of some of these kind of issues, of what it is to learn, what is the process of learning that is valuable for children, for the world at large. And there's a lot of investment needed in the teacher as well. So at one level, I agree with you that learning has to be child-centric, but at the same time, there has to be a lot of focus on the teacher. I feel on the whole, there has been less importance given to teacher education in a very serious way. And I'm wondering whether that is why many schools are so stagnant.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. I wouldn't say teacher-centric, because education is teacher-centric. Teachers have the authority, both natural and acquired, ascribed authority over the children, and that's how classrooms have often been. And so the child is at the receiving end. But I understand very much, and I completely agree that in order to make education more child-centric, and I would argue that total child-centric is also not something I go with, but it's right now the corrective that is needed.
Yeah.
And in order for that to happen, the teachers need to be prepared. And I'm completely with you on saying that teacher preparation needs very serious thought, because and you cannot, how can we prepare the teacher so that they are more reflective, more in tune with themselves, and are able to then bring out what is needed for the child in very authentic ways.
I think one of the things that many people in alternative schools try to do is with the belief that learning happens in the space of a relationship between adults and children.
Absolutely.
And if teachers have to be good at relating and interacting with children, there has to be a lot of investment taking place in them also. So in that sense, it's not teacher-centric, but more of investment needed to help the teacher become a learner facilitator.
Correct.
And it's also lifelong learning for the teacher as well. Yeah, I got that. Another issue that we can talk about is related to this one, and which is what would you say are the fundamental things that a child needs to learn, to be prepared for the world today, for the world tomorrow, for all the changes that are continuing to happen in the world? Because we seem to be learning from the same textbooks, the same style of doing exams. There's change on so many fronts. Most people in cities at least aspire for corporate jobs, and in corporate sector there are so many changes, so much happening, but the schools seem to be stuck with very similar ways of learning. So what would you say are fundamental stuff that a child needs to be prepared for, to deal with the world today?
Yeah, I think that is the central question of education. Education is preparation for life, and what seems to be happening is life as we know it is changing rapidly.
Yeah.
So that it's a perplexing question in some ways, and we are, I think, as human beings, we ourselves are responsible for the kind of rapid changes. Not all of them are positive, and at the same time, we are not sure how do we prepare for these changes. And I think I'm not sure that I have the answer or we have the answer, but I think one thing does stand out is that to help children think deeply and think carefully in a reflective manner, and also develop their own inner confidence. I think that's very important, because what seems to be happening all around us is that confidence is being eroded. It's being eroded deliberately through the forces of media, which want to actually use anxiety to drive sales, right? So people are being told they are not good enough in many ways. And even education is being sold like that. Education is now becoming more and more a commodity. And so people are made to feel inadequate.
Yeah.
I think the fundamental thing is to build that inner strength, which in some ways, if you see, people who've been away from the so-called mainstream seem to have their inner strength. They are not going to run to Google at the first hint of trouble. They are self-reliant, the kind of thing that Gandhiji also spoke about, right? So I think the key thing, one important thing would be to build this kind of self-confidence, and also the ability to think deeply and be open to learning, because to be able to see what is coming rather than blindly being led. I think I would like to add that education, at least mainstream education, mass education, has not been leading. It has been led. So when the industrialists wanted people to fit into their factories, they brought in a kind of education. And that has developed its own kind of inertia.
Yeah.
And I think the issue before us is how do we, move out of that and create some...
One of the things that I think is, it may seem rather simplistic, but we need to look at fundamentally what to eliminate, from a child's life. If not eliminate, reduce. Because, why the child is getting into so much anxiety and so much of, not having that confidence within oneself,
Right.
is an excess of exposure to social media. And recently there was an article I read about schools in the school associations in Bangalore trying to tell parents that you need to reduce screen time for children, and especially because there were certain incidents which was very undignifying to a girl and so on and so forth, and saying that this also comes in, they were bothered about it's coming in the way of studies, we may not mind something coming in the way of studies from an alternative point of view, but it's definitely also eroding children's confidence and inability to think. If I'm almost told what to think by social media.
Yeah.
So that is one major thing that's happening. Another thing, like you said before, was about taking children away from nature,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Mm.
And today there is a lot of research going on how the disconnect from nature is affecting children so terribly. Recently, I also came across an article based on some research that very young children exposed to um, social media, not social media, but a lot of screen time,
Mm-hmm.
because sometimes we see parents trying to feed their children with the phone in front,
Mhm.
so that the child is mechanically eating and there's less trouble to the parent. But apparently, that kind of excessive screen time and TV, of course, actually is creating something called childhood dementia.
Mm-hmm.
The brain cells grow less because of this. I don't know. This is some bit of research, and the thing is, the technology which is destructive to humans is coming out much faster than the research which says that it is destructive.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So by the time we realize that this is not so good for children, we are already hooked.
Correct. Yeah.
And then there are parents saying, "Oh, my child cries, throws a tantrum without a phone," and they helplessly give in.
Yeah.
So there is, I would say, coming back to the point, that one fundamental thing is that we need to see what is addictive.
Yeah.
Similar thing is also a whole lot of junk food. And junk food, I understand, is one of the major reasons for the ADHD syndrome. I mean, these incidents of ADHD is much more today compared to so many years back. And again, it is because of addiction of one kind or the other. So how to save children from addiction seems to be a very big thing, you know.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just want to add here that we have felt so, you know, what do I say? So, no, we have felt that it's really important that for people to get children connected with nature, and in fact, one can say you need more green time to reduce screen time.
Oh, that,
People are
I
using
like
that line.
That's a nice
I've
slogan.
heard this line somewhere.
Yeah.
The only way to save children from excessive screen time is to give them more green time. So,
Lovely.
we have started this fellowship called Teach for Nature Fellowship, and a conference is being organized the end of September. And we hope that to promote the idea of having classes for Nature Connect or nature education in schools, and we are trying to enroll schools and enroll people and educate parents. So, I mean, a conference may be a drop in the ocean, but we feel it's time that people woke up to these realities and shared the research behind why many thinkers, many thought leaders are saying that children need more nature. You know, the point that you brought up earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's one major thing, and I think we like to cover one more thing in this conversation, which I think is a huge thing. It's a big thing, but we'll try to share our thoughts to whatever extent we can. This is about the whole issue of culture building in a school. You know, it's almost as if a very materialistic view of education is taken, that this much stuff in the book is to be taken and put into the children's heads, you know. And that whole inputting metaphor is so strong that most educationists, I certainly wouldn't say all, but in alternative or mainstream, it's okay. But in both kinds of schools, there are people who bother about the culture of the institution, but there are many who don't. So, culture is something like osmotically, children learn many things. Unconsciously, children may learn many things. Just this fact of, sitting for 10 and 15 years, all in a row, looking at the back of another child in front of you, looking at the teacher in front, who is the major authoritative figure in the room. And what does it do to you?
Right.
to continue to be a person who will take orders from somebody or the other. Today it's the teacher, tomorrow it's my boss, and right through it's a huge economic system.
Yes. Yes.
So in multiple ways we are learned to be dumbed down. So that's something very concerning, how much the culture plays a role, or culture of people being empathetic and just nice to each other in a school, and not being punitive, not not looking the other way, or trying to underplay the bullying, or or the negatives of social media that can happen. To understand the importance of subconscious learning that can make such a huge difference to a child, and so on. I mean, you can go on with the list of things that children learn subconsciously, unconsciously. But all this is part of the culture, which is created by the values and beliefs of the people who create or co-create or build that culture. And if that's not given enough importance, that's another. I mean, to giving it importance is one thing that many alternative schools try to do, I think. But would you like to talk in general about how schools can give more importance to building culture?
I think, what you call as culture, it's a very broad term, but culture gets built in many ways. And as when I was, a professor, we have talked to the students about what is called as a hidden curriculum. What is there in the books and what is there in the exams is one part. But there are so many other things that children are learning in the school. How to be with each other, whether you want to get ahead without considering the others, me first kind of attitude. All these are can be part of the culture, and I think our responsibility as educators, especially alternative educators, is to be alert. And I think my own journey has been to look much more carefully at the culture building processes, and to be more, if I say, more explicit about the values that we hold, rather than assume that it will be somehow passed on osmotically. I think what I have learned over these 3-4 decades is that you need to be more explicit. You need to actually find ways of culture building, as it were, and it can be done, and we are still learning the process, but I believe there are ways in which, and I think corporates, as you pointed out in a previous talk that we were having, that there is a lot of wisdom from corporate world, at least among people who have very carefully thought about the institutions and organizations they are heading. So we are at this point of our journey where we are also learning and trying to in a way, I would say, reconnect with some, to surface them, and to find ways in which they find articulation and expression. And I think already I feel there has been a shift from a vague feeling of, this was not what we started out to, this is feeling better, this is closer to what we were trying to do. And the more you engage in this kind of reflexive thinking and deliberately, sometimes it can sound a little artificial, right? It just strikes me, nowadays family members keep saying I love you, and it sounds artificial, right? When we grew up,
in India,
at least to us, your mother didn't have to say she loved you, or vice versa. We accepted that. But in a larger organization with people coming and going and outside influences, I think it's good to actually be more deliberate in this kind of, what's the culture we are trying to create, and what are the values that we hold dear, and why do we hold these values. living these values, how must our actions be?
Yeah.
I think these are very, very important points. It's not enough to just say we value nature or we value each other or we respect each other, young and old. What does it mean in day-to-day, everyday practice?
Yeah.
And that is so, so important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That reminds me of a famous quote by Malcolm McLuhan saying, "The medium is the message."
Right.
Or, for instance, Gandhiji's "Be the change," or "Walk your talk,"
Yes.
and so on.
Yeah.
So, what is the hidden curriculum? If you don't, is always what is left out can be picked up rather than what you verbally say.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So it's really important that that teachers are exposed to and educated about a lot of things. And just one more thing I wanted to bring in here was about the structural issues. So today we are talking about structural violence. Structurally, an economic system, a medical system can be created as it is today to continue to perpetuate certain problems.
Right. Yeah.
Similarly, in education, there is a structural problem in the sense the very size of schools. When you have 3,000, 4,000 children, I'm not saying that those children don't need to be educated, but if structurally it's a total top-down system, what happens to the culture of that place?
Yeah.
If we have to have, given our population, large schools, how can we subdivide them into smaller cultural entities where the investment can be deeper in smaller numbers around you?
Yeah.
Because the human mind just cannot take in very large numbers. Then it becomes what you call a factory school.
Yes.
And if we need a kind of investment that is deeper in children, you absolutely need smaller. Again, I'm reminded of another, friend in school who who introduced us to this idea of the Dunbar number. So Dunbar was a person who studied the number of people who can be considered a community that a human being can relate to, given the kind of hardwiring of our brains. And if you think about it, you will find it's really true. And he says that Dunbar, that number is called the Dunbar number, is about 150, maybe max 200. So that many number, you can possibly personally know the names of everybody, even if you don't know everybody intimately, like in a smaller group or a family. And it can be a good community. But where is 200 or 150 and where is 2,000, 3,000, 4,000? So naturally, we are kind of like herds, and that very structure can make culture building difficult.
Yes.
So unless it's subdivided and there are people trained to co-hold each group as a separate, a separate entity to be, So we cannot have huge pyramidal structures. You need more horizontal organizations. So these things are important in looking at building culture.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
I think if I can add, I think that's something that I've also been thinking, and I'm familiar with the Dunbar number, but I also think in terms of the idea of scale, and often we do get asked in Purna, are you scaling up? And for me, the idea of scale is, where does it come from? It comes from an industrial metaphor. And when you're working at an intimate human level, what is the scale are you talking about? What is it that you scale, right? You don't scale relationships, you build relationships, right?
Yeah.
And similarly,
I think that's a very beautiful thing to say.
Yeah.
You don't scale relationships. You may want to scale an organization, but it doesn't work unless you also scale relationships.
Yes. So relationships have to be built, right? And for me, the metaphor is when I think it's an old idea that when you how does a bacteria do? It's not thinking of scaling. It's just using the opportunity to grow, right? And then it moves. So for me, it's more thinking in terms of, and I mean infection in a positive way. I don't mean in a negative way. So I mean this idea of, how do things propagate in the natural world. So I'm thinking of how do bacteria do it, right? They don't seem to think that I have to reach this many places or so on, but they're responding to the environment and actually, if you know biochemistry, and that's one of the subjects I enjoyed studying, biochemistry and microbiology, they're kind of so sensitively responding to the environment. There's so many small micro adjustments that they make. And so if they manage to colonize a large amount of areas, okay. I mean, I was using the metaphor of infection, but in a good way, right? So in that way, I think there is a lot to be said for being very responsive to the environment, learning from natural processes. Yeah, trees also, for example, they grow to the extent that their environment allows them. But they do have a blueprint, but they're not like thinking that I have to grow 60 feet in 6 weeks. They don't have targets like that.
That's very true. I mean, unfortunately, we are life, we are part of life, we are living in a world, in a planet where we are defined by life. We are all ecosystems in our own right, and we live in ecosystems. But yet we study so little about life.
Yes.
So that what you're talking about reminded me that, the Fritjof Capra has written something about principles of life. And what you're talking about is exactly what he describes in a more concise way, 5 or 6 or whatever number of principles of life, that life is a network of processes, that life is this, life, something like life unfolds in response to its environment, and so on and so forth. At one level, it's very simple, but at another level, we completely forget it in our institutions, because institutions are actually life too, part of life, an organization or ecosystems they are supposed to be. Yeah, that is true of all ecosystems too. And it's a really sad thing that we don't look and understand and study ecosystems enough in schools, and understand that we are ourselves ecosystems and we are part of ecosystems and so on. That sensitivity that comes from we are nature, we are life, seems to be somehow, missing in many human endeavors. So I think today we'll have to close here, Indira, because we can open up more doors in yet another podcast sometime, hopefully. But the last bit that you brought in about the bacteria and the nature of life, in a sense, I think is truly spoken like a scientist who cares about children, who cares about life also in that sense. So thank you so much for being part of this episode. And I really enjoyed this conversation. And
likewise, Sita, thank you so much.
Thank you. Education is a huge world which we can keep unraveling in so many ways. And if you found this conversation with Indira interesting, please do subscribe to our podcast. And especially if you are a parent, a young adult, or an educator. Thank you.